9 months pregnant and completely alone, Delphine Marsh signed her discharge papers with a hand that hadn't stopped shaking since the contractions started. Her husband had left for a work retreat for days earlier and hadn't answered a single call since. She told herself he'd gotten stuck somewhere. She told herself a lot of things that week. What she didn't know, sitting in that hospital bed with a baby in her arms and no ride home, was that in 14 months, a lawyer in a gray suit would knock on her door holding a folder with her husband's family name printed across the front, and that folder would make her, not him, the sole owner of a 200-acre estate, a vineyard, and a fortune his own family had spent 3 generations building. Her husband didn't know that yet either. He was about to find out the same day he came back asking for a second chance. Let me tell you how it started. My name is Delphine Marsh. I was 29 years old, working as a hospital pharmacy technician in a mid-sized town outside Sacramento, when I met Grant Ashwood at a mutual friend's barbecue. Grant was charming in the specific way that men who've never had to try very hard are charming. Effortless, a little lazy about eye contact until he decided you were worth looking at, and then suddenly you were the only person in the room. He told me on our second date that his family used to own land out near Sonoma, generations back, but that it had mostly fallen apart after his grandfather died and his father and uncle spent a decade suing each other over it. He said it lightly, like it was a funny old family story rather than a wound. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony his parents barely attended. His mother citing a migraine, his father citing a golf commitment neither of us ever verified. I noticed the absence. I told myself families were complicated, and mine wasn't exactly a postcard either. I had grown up mostly with my grandmother, Odette, after my own parents split when I was 6, and Odette had raised me on the philosophy that you build your own family out of whoever actually shows up for you. I thought that's what I was doing with Grant. For the first 2 years, it even felt true. The cracks started small, the way they always do. Grant took a sales job that kept him traveling 3 weeks out of every month, and somewhere in there, the traveling started feeling less like a job requirement and more like a preference. He stopped asking how my day went. He started describing his coworkers' spouses, women with corporate titles and matching luggage sets, with a kind of wistful admiration that made something in my chest go quiet and cold, though I couldn't have said exactly why at the time. When I got pregnant, I thought it would anchor him. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Grant left for what he called a work retreat in Lake Tahoe 4 days before my due date. I remember standing in the driveway watching him load his golf clubs into the trunk and asking, carefully, whether he was sure he wanted to be 4 hours away this close to my due date. He kissed my forehead and told me first babies are always late anyway, that he'd checked with 3 different guys at the office who all said the same thing, that he'd be back well before anything happened. Marcelo, no, wait, I need to stay with my own story here. My son's name was Theo. I went into labor 2 days later, alone in our kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter while I called Grant's phone 4 times in a row. It went to voicemail every time. I drove myself to the hospital. I want to say that again clearly because I think it's the detail that still catches in my throat more than anything else that happened after. I drove myself to the hospital, 9 centimeters dilated, gripping the steering wheel through contractions because there was no one else to call who could get there faster than I could get there myself. Theo was born at 4:47 in the morning. I held him alone in that recovery room, tears running down my face, half from exhaustion and half from a joy so enormous it scared me. And I whispered to him that whatever happened next, it was going to be the 2 of us figuring it out together. I had no idea in that moment just how completely true that sentence was about to become. Grant finally called back that afternoon. He said his phone had died at a lodge with no cell service. He said he'd drive back first thing in the morning. I believed him, because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because some tired, hopeful part of me still wanted our son to have a father who showed up. He arrived at the hospital 2 days later. The same afternoon, they discharged me. He walked in smelling faintly of sunscreen, carrying a small stuffed bear from the hospital gift shop downstairs, and told me, with a straight face, that the drive back had taken longer than expected because of traffic near the lake. I didn't argue with him in the hospital. I signed the discharge papers, buckled Theo into his car seat myself while Grant checked something on his phone in the hallway, and let him drive us home in near total silence. Something in me had already gone still and cold and clear, the way water goes right before it freezes solid. The months that followed were, on the surface, ordinary. Grant kept traveling. I kept working reduced hours at the pharmacy, adjusting to life with a newborn largely alone, because Grant's business trips somehow always seemed to land during the hardest weeks, the sleep regressions, the ear infections, the nights Theo cried for 6 straight hours, and I sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., because it was the only room where the crying didn't feel quite as loud. I told myself, over and over, that this was simply what it looked like when someone's career required travel. I had learned, growing up watching my grandmother forgive absence after absence from my own father, that women in my family had a particular talent for building an entire architecture of excuses to protect a version of a person they'd already decided to love. The excuses stopped working the day I found the credit card statement. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was going through our joint mail, sorting bills, when I opened a statement I usually let Grant handle. A charge from a boutique hotel in Napa caught my eye, not because hotels were unusual for his work trips, but because the dates overlapped exactly with a week he'd told me he was in Portland for a sales conference. I sat at the kitchen table with Theo asleep in his bouncer beside me, and I did something I'd never let myself do before. I actually looked. It didn't take long. A pattern of hotel charges, restaurant charges, all clustered around a handful of weekends that didn't match a single work trip he'd described to me. And underneath all of it, a name that kept appearing in his call logs, which I found later on a night he'd left his phone charging on the kitchen counter and forgotten to lock it. Priya. I didn't confront him immediately. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest about everything else in this story, including the parts of me that don't look particularly strong or admirable. I sat with it for 3 weeks, documenting quietly, the way you document a slow leak in a roof before you're ready to admit the whole ceiling is coming down. I photographed statements. I saved screenshots. Some cold, methodical part of me, the part I think now that came from watching my grandmother eventually stop making excuses for my father, was already building a case, even before I fully admitted to myself what the case was for. Grant came home on a Friday evening, 6 weeks after I found the first statement, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with Theo on my lap and a folder in front of me. He saw the folder before he saw my face, and something in his expression shifted immediately. The particular flicker of a man recalculating what kind of evening he's about to have. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, though I'd cried plenty in the 6 weeks leading up to that moment, alone, after Theo was asleep. I simply slid the folder across the table and asked him to explain the charges from the Napa Hotel, and the name Priya, and the 11 weekends over the past year that didn't line up with a single work trip he'd described to me. He tried denial first, the way people always do. Then he tried the softer version, that it wasn't what it looked like, that Priya was just someone from a project, that the hotel charges were team expenses he'd forgotten to submit properly. I let him talk. I had learned, over 6 weeks of quiet documentation, that letting someone talk themselves into a corner is far more effective than interrupting them on the way there. When he finally ran out of explanations, I told him I wanted a divorce. He laughed, first, an actual laugh, short and disbelieving, as though the idea that I'd follow through on anything was fundamentally absurd to him. Then, when he saw I wasn't joking, the laugh turned into something colder. He told me I'd never manage on my own with a baby. He told me I should think carefully about what I was giving up. His salary, the house, the life he built for us. He said it like a threat dressed up as concern, and I recognized the tone immediately, because I'd heard variations of it my whole life from men who mistook other people's patience for dependence. I filed the following Monday. The divorce was, by most measures, unremarkable. Grant fought for less than I expected, mostly, I think, because Priya had apparently made her own expectations clear once the affair became public within their small circle of coworkers, and Grant seemed far more interested in managing that fallout than in fighting me over custody arrangements or the modest joint savings we'd built. I kept the house, a small 3-bedroom on the edge of town that had been mine before the marriage, in my name from a small inheritance from my grandmother, which turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. Grant kept his car, his golf clubs, and eventually Priya, though I heard through a mutual friend 18 months later that hadn't lasted either. I want to skip ahead a little here, because the year that followed wasn't dramatic in the way divorces sometimes are in movies. It was ordinary and exhausting in the way that rebuilding always is. I picked up more hours at the pharmacy. My grandmother Odette, 81 years old and sharper than most people I know, moved into my guest room temporarily, which quietly became permanent and which turned out to be one of the great unplanned gifts of that entire period. She rocked Theo to sleep on nights I was too tired to stand. She taught me, in the specific unglamorous currency of shared laundry and split grocery bills, what it actually looks like when someone shows up for you without needing to be asked twice. Theo turned 1. Then he turned 14 months old on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the same week a black sedan I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway, and a man in a gray suit stepped out holding a leather folder under one arm. His name was Harlan Voss, an estate attorney representing a firm out of Sonoma County, and he asked, politely, if he could come in and speak with me privately. I remember my first instinct, standing in that doorway with Theo balanced on my hip, was a flash of cold dread. The specific fear of a woman who has recently survived one legal battle and assumes, on instinct, that any man in a suit showing up unannounced is bringing more bad news. What he brought instead took nearly 20 minutes to fully explain, and even then, I don't think I understood the actual scope of it until days later. Grant's grandfather, Edmund Ashwood, had built a 200-acre estate in Sonoma County across the middle decades of the last century. A working vineyard, several outbuildings, and a farmhouse that had been in the family for 3 generations. The property had, as Grant once told me offhandedly, been the subject of a bitter lawsuit between his father and his uncle after Edmund's death. A lawsuit that had dragged on so long and so viciously that by the time it finally resolved, both brothers were too depleted, financially and personally, to actually run the place. The vineyard had sat in a kind of legal and financial limbo for over a decade, managed at a distance by a court-appointed trustee while the family feuded elsewhere. What Grant either didn't know, or, and I still turn this thought over sometimes, wondering which is worse, chose never to mention, was that his own grandmother, Edmund's widow, Cornelia Ashwood, had quietly rewritten her portion of the family trust 6 years before her death, specifically excluding her son, Grant's father, from full control, citing in language Harlan Voss read aloud to me directly from the document, a persistent pattern of financial recklessness and personal absence that I have watched repeat itself generation after generation in the men of this family. Cornelia's revised trust stipulated that upon her death, and the resolution of the ongoing litigation between her sons, the estate would pass not directly to her grandchildren, but to whichever spouse of a grandchild could demonstrate, at the time of any grandchild's marriage or the birth of their first child, sustained financial responsibility and primary caregiving involvement. Language her own attorneys had apparently pushed back on as unusual, until Cornelia told them, according to A. Letter Harlan later showed me, that she had buried enough Ashwood men who let other people carry what they refused to, and she intended her family's land to finally reward the people who actually did the carrying. Cornelia had died for years before I ever met Grant. The litigation between his father and uncle had finally, quietly resolved itself 8 months after Theo's birth, settled out of court, with both brothers agreeing to split the estate's liquid assets and formally relinquish claims to the land itself, exhausted after over a decade of fighting. Under Cornelia's trust language, with both direct heirs having voluntarily stepped back from the property and Grant technically still married to me at the time the trust conditions were finally triggered, the entire 200-acre estate, the vineyard's operating assets, and a trust fund built from decades of accumulated rental income from the land's tenant farmers passed, in full, to me. Not to Grant, to me. Harlan explained, gently, that the trust language specifically tied inheritance to whoever held legal marital status and primary caregiving responsibility for the eldest grandchild's firstborn child at the moment the estate's conditions resolved. And because our divorce, while filed, had not yet been finalized in court on the exact date the estate litigation concluded, and because I was, without dispute, Theo's primary caregiver in every practical and legal sense. The trust named me as sole beneficiary. I sat at my own kitchen table, Theo babbling in his high chair beside me, and listened to a stranger tell me I now owned land worth, by his conservative estimate, somewhere north of $11 million. I didn't call Grant. I want to be honest about that too. Part of me, in the days that followed, genuinely considered simply never telling him at all, letting him find out through whatever channel eventually reached him, the way I'd found out about Priya through a bank statement rather than his own mouth. But Harlan explained that under the terms of the trust and the specific language around the timing of our divorce, Grant's legal team would almost certainly be notified as a matter of procedural transparency. Given his direct blood relation to the estate and his prior standing as a named contingent beneficiary before Cornelia's revised trust took precedence, which meant whether I liked it or not, Grant was going to find out. The only real choice I had was whether he'd hear it from a lawyer's letter or from me. I chose the letter. I'm not proud of that choice exactly, but I also don't regret it. Some kindnesses, I had learned by then, are not actually owed to people who spent years demonstrating they didn't deserve them. Grant showed up at my house 9 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, in the same driveway where he'd once loaded golf clubs into his trunk for days before our son was born. I remember watching him walk up the front path through the window and feeling something strange and unfamiliar settle over me, not triumph. Exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that underneath everything else. Mostly what I felt was a kind of exhausted clarity, the specific stillness of someone who has spent a long time bracing for a blow that has finally actually landed and discovered she's still standing. "We need to talk," he said, the moment I opened the door. He looked different than I remembered from the courthouse 8 months earlier. Thinner, a little grayer at the temples, dressed more carefully than his usual golf casual, as though he'd prepared for this conversation the way you prepare for a job interview. I let him in. Odette was in the kitchen with Theo, and she gave Grant the kind of long, unreadable look that made even him shift uncomfortably before she quietly picked Theo up and carried him toward the back bedroom, giving us the room. "I heard about the estate," Grant said, once we were sitting across from each other at the same table where I'd once confronted him with a folder of hotel statements. "My father called me. He's furious, by the way. Says the whole thing is a technicality that should never have held up, that his lawyers are already looking into contesting it." "Let them look," I said. "Harlan's already told me the trust language is about as airtight as anything he's seen in 15 years of estate law. Your grandmother apparently made very sure of that." Grant was quiet for a moment, turning something over. Then he did something I genuinely hadn't expected. He reached across the table, not for my hand, but for the general space between us, a gesture I recognized instantly as the opening move of a much larger performance. "Delphine," he said, "I know I made mistakes. Big ones. I know I wasn't there when Theo was born, and I know what happened with Priya was unforgivable, and I've had a lot of time to sit with that." He paused, and I watched him choose his next words with the particular care of a man who has rehearsed a speech in his car. "But we have a son together. And now, apparently, we also have this whole legacy that's supposed to belong to the Ashwood family. I think, if we're honest with ourselves, that land was never really meant for just one of us. I think it's meant for our family. Theo's family. Maybe there's a way we could figure out how to be that family again." I sat with that for a long moment, watching him, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly what I was looking at. Not remorse, not love rediscovered. A man doing arithmetic, arriving at a number, and deciding the number was worth one more attempt at a performance he'd clearly assumed would still work on me, the same way it had worked for years. "You didn't come here for me," I said quietly. "You came here for the vineyard." Grant's expression flickered, just slightly, the way a poker player's does when a bluff has been called and there's a half-second decision about whether to double down or fold. "That's not fair," he said. "I came here because I still care about you, about our family. You didn't come back from Tahoe for 4 extra days. Because of traffic," I said, cutting him off, my voice steady. "You didn't answer my calls while I was in labor because your phone died. And you didn't drive down here today because you suddenly remembered you loved me. You drove down here because your father called you angry about $11 million, and some part of you has spent the last week convinced that if you just say the right words in the right order, I'll hand you access to something you never once helped build. The silence that followed was long enough that I could hear Odette's low voice through the wall, singing something soft to Theo in the back bedroom. So that's a no, Grant finally said, and something in his voice had gone flat and cold, the performance dropping away entirely now that it had failed. That's a no, I confirmed. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he might say something cutting on his way out. Some version of the threats he'd made during the divorce, the reminders that I'd never manage on my own. Instead, he just looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, almost to himself, "My grandmother always said the women in this family end up smarter than the men who married into it." I used to think that was just an old lady being bitter. Maybe she just paid attention, I said. That's usually all it takes. He left without another word. I watched his car pull out of the driveway from the same window I'd once watched him pack golf clubs into a trunk, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something close to peace. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think it would be easy, telling this story, to skip straight to some triumphant montage of vineyard ownership and instant transformation. It wasn't like that. Inheriting an estate you know almost nothing about while raising a 14-month-old alone and working part-time at a pharmacy is not, it turns out, an instantly glamorous experience. It's mostly paperwork and unfamiliar terminology and long phone calls with accountants explaining tax implications I didn't understand, and a genuine, sustained fear that I was going to ruin something 3 generations of people had built. Harlan Voss, to his credit, didn't disappear once the initial transfer was complete. He connected me with the estate's longtime vineyard manager, a patient, weathered man named Silas Kavanaugh, who had worked the land under the court-appointed trustee for over a decade and had, by his own quiet admission, assumed the estate would eventually be sold off to some developer once the family finished tearing itself apart over it. Silas drove out to meet me personally 3 weeks after that conversation with Grant, and spent an entire afternoon walking the property with me while Odette watched Theo back at the farmhouse's newly reopened kitchen. I remember standing at the top of a gentle slope of vines that afternoon, looking out over rows that stretched further than I could easily count, and feeling a specific, disorienting kind of vertigo. The sense of having been handed something enormous by a woman I'd never met, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with me personally and everything to do with the pattern of men she'd spent her whole life watching disappoint her. She used to walk this exact row every morning, Silas told me, gesturing at the vines around us. Mrs. Ashwood, Cornelia, even into her 70s, rain or shine, told me once the land only rewards the people who actually show up for it day after day, even when nobody's watching to give them credit. I thought about that a lot in the months that followed. Mostly on the mornings I dragged myself out of bed at 5 a.m. to feed Theo, before driving out to the estate to sit in meetings with Silas and the accounting team, learning the actual mechanics of running a working vineyard from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous. It was closer in spirit to the exhausting, unglamorous work of raising a child alone, showing up again and again on the days no one was watching to give me credit for it. Grant's father, true to his word, did contest the trust. His legal team filed a challenge 11 weeks after my conversation with Grant, arguing that the trust language around marital status at the time of resolution was ambiguous, and that given the divorce had been actively filed and proceeding, the estate should revert to direct bloodline inheritance rather than passing to a spouse whose marriage was, in his words, functionally already dissolved. Harlan wasn't worried, and once I understood why, I stopped being worried too. Cornelia, it turned out, had anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. Her trust included a secondary clause, drafted with unusual specificity, stating that any contest to the primary beneficiary's claim would automatically trigger a full audit of the contesting party's own conduct during the relevant marriage or relationship, specifically examining patterns of abandonment, infidelity, or failure of caregiving responsibility, as evidence relevant to the trust's founding intent. Cornelia, apparently, had built her trust not just to reward the right kind of person, but to actively punish anyone who tried to weaponize the courts against that reward. Grant's father's legal challenge meant, functionally, that a court-appointed reviewer would examine my entire marriage to Grant in detail, the labor I went through alone, the documented pattern of absences, the affair, the divorce filing timeline, all of it laid out in careful, dispassionate legal language. I remember feeling a flash of dread at the idea of that period of my life being picked apart in a courtroom again. But Harlan reminded me, gently, that the facts of that period were not actually in dispute anywhere. I had documentation. I had photographs of the hospital discharge showing I'd checked out alone. I had phone records. I had, without ever intending to build a legal case, spent an entire painful year quietly assembling exactly the kind of record that made this exact challenge collapse within 6 weeks of being filed. The court upheld the trust in full. Grant's father, according to Harlan, was reportedly so furious about the outcome and the detailed, unflattering account of his son's conduct that became part of the public record in the process, that he stopped speaking to Grant for the better part of a year afterward, blaming him, apparently, for losing a fortune he seemed to believe should have somehow remained under Ashwood male control, regardless of what his own mother had explicitly, deliberately arranged otherwise. I felt no particular satisfaction watching that unfold, beyond a kind of quiet, exhausted relief. Mostly what I felt was gratitude toward a woman I'd never had the chance to meet, who had apparently spent the last years of her life building a legal structure specifically designed to make sure the next generation of women in her family wouldn't have to fight the same battles she'd watched her own daughters-in-law fight and lose. Life on the estate slowly found its own rhythm over the following year. I kept my job at the pharmacy for the first several months, unwilling to fully believe the vineyard's income was real until I'd seen several consecutive seasons prove it, a caution Silas said reminded him, with a small smile, of Cornelia herself in her early years managing the property after Edmund's death. Odette moved with Theo and me into the farmhouse permanently, taking over what had once been Cornelia's own reading room as her private sitting space, and within months had somehow become close friends with 3 of the tenant farmers' wives, hosting a standing Thursday coffee, gathering that Silas swore had better attendance than any board meeting he'd ever run. Theo grew from a 14-month-old barely walking through unfamiliar rooms into a toddler who knew every inch of that farmhouse, who called Silas I and followed him around the equipment shed asking endless questions about tractors, who fell asleep most nights to the sound of Odette humming the same old songs she'd once hummed to soothe me as a child, decades earlier, in an entirely different kitchen. I met Marcus Delacroix, the estate's viticulture consultant, during my second harvest season, when Silas brought him in to help modernize some of the vineyard's aging irrigation systems. Marcus was quiet, precise, entirely uninterested in performing anything for anyone. The exact opposite, in almost every visible way, of the man I'd married 8 years earlier. He asked me detailed questions about soil composition and crop yields with the same genuine curiosity he later asked me about Theo's favorite dinosaur, and he never once, across the many months I came to know him, asked a single question about the estate's value or my inheritance beyond what was strictly necessary for his work. I noticed that the same way I think most people eventually notice the specific quality of someone who has never once made you feel like a number. Small things first, the way he'd quietly fix a broken latch on the equipment shed without mentioning it, the way he remembered, unprompted, that Theo was terrified of the vineyard's resident barn owl and always made a point of walking the long way around that section of the property when Theo tagged along. Nothing dramatic, just the steady accumulation of a person showing up, consistently, in ways that asked for nothing in return. Grant, for his part, remained a distant, occasional presence in Theo's life. Scheduled weekend visits that grew steadily less frequent as the years passed, eventually settling into an arrangement that was cordial, formal, and entirely without warmth. I never told Theo the full story of that period, not in detail, not while he was young enough for it to shape how he understood his own father. I simply made sure, every single day, that he knew exactly who had shown up for him. Odette, Silas, eventually Marcus, and let the pattern of that speak for itself, the same way my own grandmother had once let her steady, unglamorous presence speak louder than my own father's absence ever could. 3 years after that first conversation with Harlan Voss at my kitchen table, I stood at the same spot on the vineyard slope where Silas had first walked me through the rows, watching the late afternoon light move across land that had once belonged to a woman I never met, but who had, in her own quiet, deliberate way, spent the last years of her life making absolutely certain that the next woman who inherited her legacy would be someone who'd actually earned it through showing up, not through a last name. Marcus found me there, as he often did in the evenings, and stood beside me without saying much, the way he always did, comfortable in silence in a way Grant never once managed to be. Theo told me today he wants to be a vintner when he grows up, Marcus said eventually, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Apparently that's the technical word. He was very insistent I use it correctly. I laughed, the specific easy laugh that had taken me years to fully find again after Grant. He gets that precision from you, you know. Not from me. He gets his stubbornness from you, Marcus said. I've watched you argue with the county about that irrigation permit for 6 months straight. The kid comes by it honestly. We stood there a while longer, watching the light change over the vines, and I thought, not for the first time, about the specific strange architecture of how I'd ended up exactly here. A marriage that broke because a man decided showing up was optional, a grandmother-in-law I never met who decided her family's legacy should reward exactly the opposite instinct. A lawyer's knock on the door that had once terrified me and turned out to be the beginning of an entirely different life than the one I thought I was building. I think about Cornelia Ashwood often, more than I ever expected to think about a woman I only know through legal documents and Silas's fond, weathered stories. I think about the specific, deliberate cruelty and kindness of what she built, a trust designed not to hand a fortune to whoever happened to share her blood, but to whoever demonstrated, through years of unglamorous, uncredited effort, that they actually deserved to hold something that large and lasting. Grant never understood that distinction, I don't think, not fully, even after everything. He believed, right up until the moment the court ruled against his father's challenge, that inheritance was primarily a matter of bloodline and timing and the right words said in the right order at a kitchen table. He never seemed to grasp that Cornelia had spent decades watching men in her own family confuse being born into something with having earned it, and had built in the last legal document of her life a very specific correction to that pattern. I didn't inherit an estate because I was married to the right man at the right moment, though that's technically, legally, how it happened on paper. I inherited it because I drove myself to a hospital alone at 4 a.m. and didn't fall apart. Because I sat on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m. with a screaming infant night after night, with no one else in the house to hand him to. Because I built, slowly and without any grand plan, exactly the kind of quiet, sustained caregiving that a woman I never met had decided, years before I ever entered this family, was the only currency that should ever actually matter. If there's a single thing worth carrying away from a story like mine, I don't think it's the vineyard or the number attached to it, satisfying as that number eventually became to see written down. I think it's this: the people who leave you alone in the hardest moments are rarely thinking, in that moment, about what it will eventually cost them. They assume the cost is yours alone to carry quietly, while they're off somewhere easier. What they don't expect, what Grant certainly never expected, standing in my driveway with golf clubs in his trunk for days before his own son was born, is that someone somewhere might have been watching the whole time, keeping score in a ledger far more permanent than either of us ever imagined, and waiting patiently for the moment the truth of who actually showed up would finally, undeniably, come due.